Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine towns rising up, monks literally fleeing for their lives, knights burned at the stake for heresy, and powerful kings clashing, really clashing, with church officials over, well, who decides what's true, and maybe more importantly, who gets the cash. That's the world we're diving into today.
Welcome, everyone. Yes, we're taking a deep dive into the fascinating and often pretty brutal history of the Inquisition and all these different forms of religious dissent it tried to stamp out across medieval Europe. And we're drawing everything from this incredible stack of sources you've shared with us.
Exactly. So our mission as we explore your material together is to kind of sift through it all, find those key nuggets, the major players, the flashpoints, those surprising little details that really shine a light on this complicated time where faith, power, and resistance just got tangled together.
Right. We're not just listing dates and names. We're trying to get a feel for the actual forces at play, the things that shake centuries of European history.
Okay, so let's set the scene first. Your sources, they show that even before any formal widespread Inquisition, you had dissenting groups, Cathari, Waldenses.
Yeah.
They were already popping up in different places, Leon, Passau.
Right. But the idea of a central church body, specifically designed to hunt down heresy, that wasn't universally popular, not at all.
No, definitely not.
And what's really striking is how unevenly it all started. It wasn't some boom continent-wide thing overnight. Take Castile, even with those earlier Catharis around, the Inquisition just didn't take root there initially.
And Portugal. Your sources point to King Afonso II. Way back, 1211, he basically said, nope, no Dominican inquisitors here. He insisted heresy cases stayed with the local bishops.
Yeah, the traditional courts, and that wasn't just like a brief pushback.
No, it lasted nearly 150 years. The whole office was basically dormant there until the 16th century. It's kind of amazing.
It really highlights that systematic persecution for heresy. The way the Inquisition did it was, well, it was largely unknown in lots of places until someone actively brought the institution in. You even see rulers like Alonso the Wise making their own laws about religious stuff before any widespread inquisitorial activity.
So it shows the church wasn't just dropping this new system on everyone. It was wrestling with existing local powers, different traditions,
right.
Sometimes places that didn't really have a system for dealing with dissent at all.
And nowhere really was that struggle more intense, judging by your sources, than in France, especially Languedoc. That was Cathar heartland, and the resistance was, well, visceral and violent.
Yeah, we see some early examples of just how harsh it could be. This Frère Ferrer mentioned imprisoning and burning people in a city that rebelled. This wasn't like due process.
No, it was summary judgment backed up by force. And that kind of harshness, it provoked a reaction. Look at Narbonne, 1234, 1235. The Dominican prior, Francois Ferrer, starts this sort of volunteer inquisition and starts locking people up.
And the townspeople fought back.
They did. In 1235, they rose up, drove the Dominicans right out, sacked the convent, and crucially, destroyed the records. A pretty clear message. Get out.
And the local bigwigs, like Count Raymond of Toulouse, they're caught in the middle. He's such a complicated figure here.
Totally. He's under massive pressure from the Pope. Your sources mention one papal brief, 1236. The language is incredibly harsh, accusing him of being a fodder, basically a protector of heretics, just because, his lands were a refuge.
So he had to at least look like he was complying, taking oaths to banish the Fates, those knights linked to Cathars, and capture Montsegur.
Exactly. He had to make a show of it. But then he'd clash with individual inquisitors like Pierre Sella, who he thought was just out to get him personally.
But the Inquisition, they had their ways. Your sources talk about the impact of testimony, like from this Raymond Gros, called an act of providence.
Yeah.
Apparently, it shocked the heretics. People fled, recanted, gave up information.
And the fallout was immediate, severe. Exhuming bodies, burning corpses, a huge wave of confiscations. Your sources really stress what a massive blow this was to heresy in Toulouse right then.
Wow. And just when you think maybe things might cool down, boom, more violence. That massacre at Avignon, 1242. Inquisitors, their staff just murdered. Guillaume de Massempers, named as a ringleader, that feels like a real turning point.
Oh, absolutely. That forced Count Raymond's hand completely. He had to turn what was apparently a bit of a sham siege of Montsegur into a real military campaign. And after that whole revolt, religious conformity got explicitly tied to political loyalty.
How so?
Well, King Louis, even though he was somewhat lenient, made every man over 15 swear an oath. Not just to help the church against heresy, but also to help the king against Raymond. So being a good Catholic meant being loyal to the French crown, to foreign rule.
Right, tying faith to obedience.
Right.
which leads us to the fall of Montsegur in 44, a huge symbolic win for the anti-heresy side, even if, as your sources say, the treasure, maybe texts got smuggled out first.
Yeah, exactly. And even after all that fighting, the Inquisition didn't just pack up. The Dominicans actually asked to be let off the hook after Avignon. It was so dangerous. But Pope Innocent V said no.
And it wasn't just top-down enforcement either.
No, you had local groups forming, these associations pledging to help the bishops and inquisitors, even offering rewards for turning in heretics. Grassroots support, in a way.
But resistance also came from the top, right? Roger Bernard of Foix, powerful guy called an enemy of God. His whole family sounds involved in heresy.
Deeply. Wife and sister were Waldenses, another sister a Cathar perfecta. He was forced to submit officially, but didn't exactly rush to fulfill his oath. And even after he died, his son faced accusations. It shows the Inquisition could go after powerful families, even if it took years.
Okay, so this whole struggle in Languedoc, it shows the massive effort involved, the violence, the pushback, and how crucial secular rulers were, sometimes resisting, sometimes forced to cooperate.
Precisely. Which leads us perfectly into the next big dynamic your sources highlight, the growing friction between the Inquisition and the increasingly powerful French monarchy, especially under King Philippe IV, Philip the Fair.
Right. This is where the power balance really starts to shift, isn't it? Instead of just dealing with local lords, the Inquisition starts bumping up against the crown itself.
Exactly. And you see people realizing this. Citizens facing inquisitorial pressure, like in Carcassonne, they start appealing directly to the king's guys, like Chancellor Pierre Chalus in 1285.
And when the inquisitors went too far, like throwing the citizen's notary in jail in 1291, the appeal went straight to King Philippe.
It did, and his reaction is, well, it's a landmark moment. That royal letter, May 13th, 1291, it's incredibly critical. Philippe slams the Inquisition's methods, talks about injuries to the innocent through the newly invented system of torture, fake convictions, the land being scandalized and rendered desolate.
Wow. And he told his own officials not to help them.
Explicitly ordered royal officials not to obey the inquisitors in these kinds of matters. That's a massive challenge from the king himself.
And it had an effect on the ground.
Oh, yeah. People felt emboldened. Popular resistance flared up again in Carcassonne in 1295. Citizens openly resisting, even roughing up Dominicans.
And it wasn't just street fights, it went to court too.
Yes. The case with the Carcassonne inquisitors, Bertrand and Nicolas d'Abbeville, it ended up in the royal court. Philippe later declared their agreement fraudulent, and a royal official even confessed Inquisitor Nicholas had bribed him. Corruption creeping in.
Then in Albi, the prosecutions apparently caused real terror.
Yeah.
Victims choosing for their wealth. Nicholas accused of just making up evidence.
That's what the sources suggest. And you see these personal tragedies like Emeric Castel desperately trying to clear his father's name after some deathbed heresy charge in 1300. It shows the potential for abuse, for settling scores, or just greed.
So the people of Albi appealed, and the king actually removed the inquisitor, Fous de Saint-Georges. That sounds huge. Unprecedented, your sources call it.
It really was. A royal commission sided with this figure, Perquigny, who was backing the citizens, and boom, Philippe removes the inquisitor in 1302. The Dominicans tried to stall, keep folks there for a bit, but the king's decision stood.
So even his successor, the famous Bernard Guy, needed the king's backing.
He did. Guy was energetic, no doubt, but he still needed royal letters ordering people to obey him. The Inquisition, which started as mainly a church tool, was becoming more and more dependent on and accountable to the French crown.
And what happened to Perquigny, the guy who helped the citizens?
Not a happy ending. He died in exile. And because he'd impeded the Inquisition, legally he was considered a heretic. They actually wanted to dig up his bones. His sons had to fight for years just to clear his name.
Unbelievable. And the most famous challenge, Bernard de Lisieux, a Franciscan speaking out for the people.
Eloquently, apparently. Arguing before the Pope for Albi and Carcassonne, and your sources highlight that incredibly bold claim he made.
That St. Peter and St. Paul would be convicted by inquisitorial methods.
Yes, and he stuck by it when challenged. But his activism got him mixed up in some risky political plot involving the King of Majorca's son, which Philippe uncovered.
And Philippe didn't react well.
Not at all. Vengeance. A court set up in Carcassonne using torture. Bernard de Lisieux was tried, acquitted of plotting against the Pope, but found guilty of other stuff, including, apparently, 70 counts of perjury, degraded, locked up for life on bread and water. The king used the system to crush him. It showed who really held the power.
And it wasn't just about justice or faith anymore, was it? Increasingly about control and money.
Definitely. Your sources point out that confiscations often didn't even cover the Inquisition's costs. So, by the late 14th century, in some places, the Inquisitor wasn't really a church agent funded by fines anymore. He was a royal official, paid by the city.
Wow, that's a fundamental shift.
It is, and that state control just get deeper. In 1364, you have a bishop and inquisitor appealing to the royal parliament, the High Court, which takes the case, even though it's a purely spiritual question, and tells them to obey an archbishop. And by 1328, an inquisitor is actually calling himself deputed by the king, not the pope.
Following the king's policy, basically.
Right, extending crown jurisdiction. Even way later, 1485, an inquisitor describes his authority as coming from the Holy See and the Parliament, acknowledging both but showing how power was shared and increasingly dominated by the secular state. The French kings had effectively tamed the Inquisition and made it part of their own machinery.
Okay, so France is one major story. But stepping outside France, your sources show this whole dance between the Inquisition and secular rulers played out really differently elsewhere depending on the local politics.
Absolutely. Italy is a great example. Politically fragmented,
Right.
right? City-states, principalities. So you get a real patchwork. Early on, there's resistance in Lombardy, cities saying the rules are too harsh, and politics and heresy get completely intertwined. Civic rivalries often just got in the way of any systematic persecution.
Emperor Frederick II, he talked a good game about wiping out heresy, ordered secular help for inquisitors.
Yeah.
But was it actually enforced consistently?
Not really. Look at Florence. Early Dominican inquisitors didn't achieve much because the heretics often had political protection, like from the Ghibellines, Frederick supporters. Powerful families were involved.
And Florence pushed back later, too.
They did. They resisted appointing a papal inquisitor for a while, and when one, Fra Piero di Gila, was finally appointed, he got accused of shaking people down for money, ended up a fugitive, and the city actually got the Pope to replace him. Cities asserting their authority.
Venice sounds even tougher.
Oh yeah, Benizi was famously independent. For decades, popes kept urging them, but they just refused to write imperial or papal anti-heresy laws into their own statutes. Even much later, they insisted the local bishop had to be involved for an inquisitor to do anything. And their own laws, like those Milanese statutes mentioned from 1343 to 1495, sometimes just ignore the Inquisition completely.
Were there direct clashes sometimes?
Yep. Milan, 1356. A Franciscan inquisitor arrests some Jewish converts. Secular officials step in, stop the trial, and even torture the inquisitor's assistants. The state arms sometimes actively block the Inquisition.
But it wasn't all resistance in Italy. You mentioned those Croces.
Right, the Prost ones. These were groups often linked to the Dominicans who actively supported the Inquisition. They'd show up in church with swords drawn during the gospel reading, basically signaling they were ready to fight heresy. So it was complex. Not everyone was against it.
And Naples. What was the situation there?
In Naples, the monarchy definitely put limits on it. By 1402, there's a royal decree giving Jews the right to appeal inquisitorial sentences straight to the king. Later, all sentences needed royal review. Secular power consistently acted as a check in Naples.
Okay, shifting over to Aragon. The Inquisition started pretty early there, 1238. Did it operate differently?
It was established early, yes, with Dominican commissioners. But while it stayed active, some cases from the 1400s suggest its power, or maybe the terror it inspired, had lessened somewhat. Your sources mention one friar, Pedro Salaso, getting thrown in jail for months by nobles he'd annoyed while following papal orders.
So powerful people could push back, but maybe not everyone.
Exactly. It still seems to have had teeth against the poor or unconnected. Miguel Ferriz is noted for burning quite a few Waldenses around 1440. And the fact that people were still squabbling over who got appointed inquisitor shows the office still held some sway.
Now, Germany seems like a really dramatic case of resistance, effectively blocking the papal inquisition.
For a significant time, yes. Initially, heresy was mostly handled by local bishops, but then Pope Gregory the X appointed Conrad of Marburg in 1227. And Conrad, well, his zeal was described as, frankly, crazy and cruel.
Supported by the Pope, but facing pushback locally.
Immediately, from bishops, princes, they saw his methods were extreme. He'd accuse anyone based on flimsy evidence, used informants, burned knights, priests, prominent people. Bishops literally warned him to calm down.
What brought him down?
He overreached. He accused some very powerful counts. He was summoned to the Diet of Mainz in 1233, and shortly after, on the road back, he was murdered, ambushed, and killed.
And the Pope was furious, called him a martyr. But the Germans didn't agree.
Not at all. The Pope was outraged, yes. But the German Diet, the assembly of princes and bishops at Frankfurt in 1234, did something amazing. They basically put Conrad's memory on trial, and the German prelates openly declared he'd been justly killed.
Wow, that's a united front.
It was. And that collective action effectively slammed the door on the Papal Inquisition in Germany for decades. Later attempts to bring it back, like by Innocent VI in 1353, faced problems. There were complaints that inquisitors were just going after Orthodox groups like Beghards and Beguines for money.
And the bishops kept their own authority.
They did. They continued using their own episcopal inquisitors well into the 15th century. That centralized papal model just never fully took hold in Germany the way it did elsewhere.
Okay, so while the Inquisition is dealing with all this regional resistance and the rise of state power, new kinds of religious movements are popping up too, some challenging the church in completely new ways.
Right. Your sources talk about these semi-religious groups emerging in the late 13th, early 14th century. Beguines, Beghards, Lollards, Brethren of the Free Spirit. The church got nervous when these groups operated outside its direct control.
And some were drawn to mystical ideas. Eckhart.
Yeah, figures like Master Eckhart. Ideas about being absorbed into God or reaching a state of perfection where sin becomes impossible. From the church's view, that could easily slide into heresy. The Flagellants, too, started as this popular repentance movement, even got papal blessing at first. But later they became suspect. Figures like Venturino ended up accused of heresy by the Inquisition.
But the biggest challenge, the most successful one mentioned in your sources, seems to come from John Wycliffe's influence, especially how it spread to Bohemia and basically lit the fuse for the Hussite movement. Wycliffe is called a heresiarch with unprecedented success.
His ideas were fundamentally challenging to the church's structure and authority. The idea that a sinful priest's sacraments weren't valid, denying the power of the keys, the church's right to own vast property, saying excommunication didn't matter, and his views on the Eucharist, that remanence idea, that the bread and wine essentially remained bread and wine after consecration, that struck at the heart of medieval doctrine.
And this paved the way for Czech reformers like Jan Hus.
Exactly. Huss started out mainly criticizing corrupt clergy, which wasn't that unusual, but he got drawn into debates about Wycliffe's doctrines, clashed with others at the university. His defiance grew, especially over the sale of indulgences by Pope John XXIII in 1412. He vehemently opposed it.
And this wasn't just academic debate, it caught on with the people.
Oh, definitely. When people who supported Huss were executed, they were seen as martyrs. It caused riots. People broke prisoners out of jail. There's that amazing story of one of Huss's followers kicking over a friar's table full of relics and indulgences. Real popular anger.
So Huss gets summoned to the Council of Constance. He appeals, writes De Ecclesia, attacking the papacy using Wycliffe's ideas.
Right. And this brings us to the whole controversy over the safe conduct. Huss traveled there under a promise of safety from Emperor Sigismund, but the council basically said, doesn't matter, we can prosecute anyone for heresy, safe conduct or not.
Your sources describe that moment in his final hearing. He mentions the safe conduct, looks right at Sigismund.
And Sigismund supposedly blushed deeply. A powerful image. The official argument was that you didn't have to keep promises made to a heretic.
So the trial went ahead, based on his writings, testimony from opponents.
Yes, people like Pallas and Michael de Causas testified against him. He was apparently denied access to his books for a time. Intense pressure on him to recant, but he refused. Your source mentions his replies showed sharp intellect and memory, even under all that pressure.
And the end came July 6, 1415. Declared a heretic, degraded from the priesthood, handed over to be burned.
Yes. And his composure at the stake was widely noted, even though the death was agonizing. And those details about the executioners trying to prevent relics, burning his cloak, digging up the earth around the stake, throwing the ashes in the Rhine show how significant they knew he was, how potent his memory could be.
The reaction in Bohemia must have been intense.
Immediate and defiant. The council tried to smooth it over, claiming Huss was treated gently. But the Bohemian nobles protested fiercely, refused to obey the council, declared freedom of preaching. Bohemia basically united against the council and against Sigismund, who they felt had betrayed Huss.
Leading straight into the Hussite Wars.
Directly. The council appointed an inquisitor nicknamed Iron John, asked Sigismund for troops, and by 1420 you have crusades being launched against Bohemia.
But the Hussite movement wasn't monolithic. There were factions.
Right. You had the complexities, often more moderate, nobles involved. Their main sticking point, apart from church lands, was demanding communion in both kinds, both bread and wine for the laity, symbolized by the chalice.
And the Taborites.
They were more radical, based in their stronghold of Tabor. Questioning the priesthood itself, debating transubstantiation, more Republican in outlook, wanting real independence and control over confiscated church property.
Were there attempts to reconcile? The Council of Basel?
Yes, negotiations happened in 1433. They led to the Compactada in 1436. This was a major concession, granting communion in both kinds, though with conditions. It was forced on the church by the Hussites' military success and political pressure. A unique outcome.
But the peace didn't hold between the Hussite factions themselves.
No, political and religious differences ran too deep. It led to open war between Calixtans and Taborites. The Battle of Lepen in 1434 was decisive, a brutal defeat for the Taborites. Your sources mention maybe 13,000 dead, but only 700 prisoners taken. It shows how vicious the internal conflict was.
So the Taborites were militarily crushed.
Yes, Sigismund used the division to consolidate power and suppress them further, but even though the Taborite military force was broken, their radical ideas didn't just disappear. Your sources suggest the Bohemian Brethren, who emerged later, were the real inheritors of those more radical Hussite traditions. They kept printing books and faced persecution later on.
And the Compactada, the agreement allowing communion in both kinds, that actually lasted.
It did, politically at least. The papacy was always reluctant to fully accept it, but Bohemian rulers insisted on it. Your sources mention Ferdinand I of Austria promising to uphold it in Bohemia as late as 1526. That's over a century after Huss died, showing the profound, lasting impact of the whole movement on that region. So even as these huge dramas like the Hussite Wars were unfolding, the basic machinery of the Inquisition, it still existed in other places into the 15th century, though, its actual power and effectiveness really varied.
Right, you see these mentions of Waldenses still being burned sometimes, like in Dauphiné. Inquisitors are still active in Aragon, even if they face challenges. Activity even pops up again in Flanders after centuries, and you still get individual cases like Herman of Ryswick burned in the Netherlands in 1512. It hadn't vanished.
No, not at all. And your sources point out that popes kept appointing inquisitors for different districts, which suggests Rome still wanted to maintain the institution, keep that potential power available, even if secular states were increasingly boxing it in or using it for their own ends.
So, stepping back now from this really deep dive into your sources, what seems to really stand out is this incredible constant tension across medieval Europe. You've got this hugely powerful institution, the church, trying to define and enforce one single truth.
And it's constantly bumping up against resistance. From all these different forms of religious dissent, some old, some totally new.
And the whole thing is shaped by the role of secular power, right?
Mm-hmm.
Kings, princes, cities. Sometimes they're eager partners in cracking down. Sometimes they're pushing back hard against the Inquisition. And more, they're figuring out how to control it for their own political and financial gain.
Exactly. It's not a straight line. It's messy, complicated faith, power, resistance, local differences, adaptation, moments of incredible defiance, cynical political moves. It's all in there, illuminated by the specifics in your material.
It really shows the resilience, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Of different ways of believing. And also the lengths that institutions will go to try and force everyone to think the same way.
It certainly does.
So thinking about that whole arc we've traced, from that really intense, localized persecution in places like Languedoc, met with violence, through the period where powerful kings wrestle control away from the church, making the Inquisition almost an arm of the state, and all the while these new disruptive heresies like the Hussites are fundamentally challenging everything, forcing concessions, sparking wars. What does this history, as laid out in your sources, ultimately tell us about how effective it is, or maybe how limited it is to try and enforce uniform belief just by using external force? That's quite something to ponder.